Good evening from Jakarta, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the virtual public discussion on North-South Middle Powers, Recalibrating Strategic Autonomy in a Multipolar World. This virtual discussion is brought to you by Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia, the largest grassroots foreign policy group in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and Indo-Pacific. Last year, FPCI launched Middle Power Studies Network, a unit to study the role of middle power countries in the 21st century. For this, we engage scholars, policymakers, practitioners, and leading thinkers in middle power countries and around the globe to explore how middle powers are changing and shaping in global affairs. First of all, let us welcome our distinguished speakers for today's discussion, Dr. Stefan Mayer, Professor Harsh Pant, and Professor Feliciano Deza Guimarães. We are pleased to welcome over 180 participants from 40 countries, including Brazil, India, Australia, Japan, South Africa, Nigeria, Poland, Malaysia, and Qatar, tuning in through Zoom and FPCI's YouTube channel. Without further ado, please let us invite our founder and chairman of FPCI, Dr. Dino Patijalal, the chair of Middle Power State Network, to lead the discussion. Pak Dino, you may have the floor.
Thank you very much, Adinda, and I'm pleased to welcome all the participants in today's webinar titled North-South Middle Powers, Recalibrating Strategic Autonomy in Multipolar World. And we are so fortunate to have strategic thinkers from three major middle powers, one from the global north, which is from Germany, Stefan Mayer, and two from the global south, which is from Brazil, Feliciano Deza Guimarães. I hope I didn't kill your name or I didn't violate your name, Feliciano. And then Harsh Pant from India. And the reason why we are holding this discussion is that the term concept strategic autonomy, I think, is the most, both in official declarations and also in academic discussions among the think tanks. So you hear a lot about it. And I think it's important to dig deeper, to scratch deeper into the concept in terms of what the concept actually means. And on a practical basis, how do countries benefit from having strategic autonomy? And how they use this to advance their foreign policy goals. And I think there is a trend now where middle powers, both of the North, but especially the global South, are more and more using strategic autonomy as a way to navigate the complex international landscape that are facing them. And we will also explore how middle powers relate to a world of multipolarity and how the strategic autonomy that they have allow them to pursue a more versatile diplomacy that allows them to be more empowered and more able to play the game of strategic hedging. So with that introduction, I would like to begin our discussions by asking the panelists, and I think I'll start with Professor Harsh Pant from Indian Department at King's College in London, and also Vice President for Studies and Foreign Policy at Observer Research Foundation. What is your understanding of strategic autonomy? Professor Harsh.
Hi, Dino, and thanks for having me part of this very interesting discussion. As you rightly point out, there has been this resurgence of this idea of a strategic autonomy in international affairs, and countries, especially middle powers, are finding it relatively useful to relate to the circumstances in which they find themselves in. And in some ways, the structural realities are what they are. You have immense geopolitical, geoeconomic contestation. You have the decline of multilateralism. The space, in fact, is in some ways is shrinking for countries to have, you know, to conduct their foreign policy in ways that perhaps that's the kind of space that was available in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War. Now, I think you know what seems to be the narrative, what seems to be the approach of some of the emerging powers is to use this structural disadvantage and turn it around to their advantage. Like if for example, there is this geopolitical contestation, the sharpening of polarity, the polarization, the decline of multilateralism, the contestation about norms and values, then I think it also allows for a new voice to emerge and shape that global order in ways that perhaps is relevant to the challenges of our time. And at a time when you do not see a lot of the conversation about the global south being on the global agenda, perhaps this articulation of a strategic autonomy allows for new possibilities to emerge. Now, in the context of India, of course, you know, the idea of strategic autonomy is very old. We have seen, for example, countries like India and Indonesia during the Cold War talking about non-alignment. In some ways, that was an attempt to get autonomy from a very structured and hierarchical international order. That it was highly contested, it was highly polarized, and yet you had this drive in certain countries in the global south that we want to retain our independence of action. And I think that non-alignment, the idea of non-alignment, allowed for that possibility for some time. It may not have worked for every country all the time, but certainly the idea was very democratic in its ethos, that we do not want our policy choices to be determined by bloc power politics. We want our policy choices, whether our strategic choices, whether they are in the field of development, whether they are in the field of our security partnerships, to be determined by what our interests would be and how we want to structure them. And I think that line of thinking continues even till date. And I think that has not gone away in India, that has not gone away in a number of countries that were part of that idea. Therefore, when you look at today, India talking of strategic autonomy, of course, it is there are elements of that strategic autonomy that are different from the past. But I think that line of thinking still remains, that we want to be to determine our own freedom of choice. We want to be autonomous in deciding how we want to move ahead in the global order, what partnerships we do, what sort of how we shape and configure the structural realities to our advantage. Now, the difference, I think, which in some ways is also very interesting. During the Cold War, in some ways, this was the strategy of the weak, that here are these vulnerable countries that were banding together and saying that, look, we want strategic autonomy as the most, as an approach to global affairs. Today, in some ways, it is the strategy of what you were defining as middle powers, and these powers that are emerging, these powers that whose voices are more prominent on the global stage. So I think many of these countries are speaking from a degree of self-confidence. They are not, they are there to shape the global order. They are not there to just be recipient of the global order being shaped by others. And therefore, this juxtaposition becomes very important. And in the Indian context, what India has done is India is now increasingly saying that in the past, for example, if our idea of strategic autonomy was to be away from partnerships, close partnerships. Today, we want to be close partners of several countries. Partnerships become enabling, different kinds of partnerships. In the context of India, it is often pointed out that, you are member of Quad, you are member of BRICS. And at times there is a juxtaposition of why is it these are contradictory. But I think India's argument is that it is these partnerships that allow us to be strategically autonomous. It is these partnerships that give us greater space to maneuver with regard to different poles and power capabilities that exist in the international order. So in that sense, I think while there is a distinct continuity of thought in terms of the idea, the implementation, the operationalization of the idea of strategic autonomy in today's context is very original. And I think it is contextual in today's time, that today's environment, today's international system allows for certain possibilities to emerge, and that possibilities perhaps have been taken on hold by some of these countries, including India and some of the other countries. And I think that is what is being reflected in this discourse on strategic autonomy, that we want this, this international system to be shaped by us rather than we continuously being shaped by the international order.
Yeah, thank you, Harsh. I want to just follow up a little bit on that. And by the way, those who are following our discussions, please post your questions in the chat box and we'll get to you later. But I'm interested in your point that a lot of countries that have strategic autonomy enter into partnerships. Yeah, and that's very true for many countries around the world. But what if you are strategically autonomous and then you enter a partnerships where you become a junior partner, right? Where it's not an equal partnership, but a partner where you are rather submissive relative to the power of your partner. Is there a risk when countries enter into that kind of partnerships that their strategic autonomy will be compromised?
I do think that there is a danger, and I do think that those, in terms of partnerships, how do we define those partnerships, or and the parameters of those partnerships? I think they play a very important role. But I think what is also, in some ways, what is happening in today's world is that because you have this intense polarization that is also happening, it allows for this possibility that, look, India can be perhaps part of Quad in a certain sense, this quadrilateral security dialogue with Australia, US, Japan, in the context of the maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, and which has a certain kind of a functional attribute, that it is a partnership for a limited reason. It is not an all-encompassing partnership. Similarly, BRICS is a partnership where emerging economies are saying we want greater voice in global financial architecture, global economic architecture, and therefore it's a partnership for a certain reason. The countries there may have differences in their in their ideologies, in their sometimes they're also in their interests, but in terms of the functional core, there is something that they can all coalesce around. So I do think that given the nature of the fluidity of the international order that we are passing through, these kind of partnerships perhaps have become more regular and more in some ways more germane to our understanding of where we want to go with our engagement. There is always going to be a danger about these, because in international system, in international order, we know not all countries are equal. Some countries are more equal than others. There are states which have greater capabilities. But I think having multiple or often competing partnerships, it does allow you that flexibility of operating, and in the Indian context, it has. Now, if you look at the example of the Ukraine crisis, India has a strong historical partnership with Russia, and India continues to have a very strong partnership post-Cold War with the West. Now, when the Ukraine crisis started, there was a moment when it looked as if India's partnership with the West is going to crumble under the weight of the Ukraine crisis. But it did not happen, partly because I think it allowed for new possibilities to emerge. I think over a period of time, as the Ukraine crisis emerged, India was able to explain its side of the story much better to the West. West was able to comprehend that argument much better under the arc lights of the Ukraine crisis. And at the same time, India was able to adjust and argue for a more balanced relationship with Russia also, because Russia was also facing certain this crisis where Russia had to engage with China on the one hand, and almost this danger of becoming a junior partner to China was also the overhang over Russia's relationship with China. And having a relationship with India allowed for some balance in Russian foreign policy. So I think maybe it's the nature of this particular international order that we are passing through allows for greater resilience in some of these partnerships than perhaps it would have been possible before. But there is always going to be that danger. If you're not careful, you will have to navigate very, very carefully these partnerships. If you're not careful, you will end up, if not, end up being a junior partner. If not in reality, then at least in perception. That also has costs in international politics.
Thank you. Thank you. Now I turn to Professor Feliciano Deza Guimares, who's Professor of International Relations at the Brazilian Center of International Relations. Professor, Your take on strategic autonomy from Brazil's viewpoint.
Thank you, Dr. Dino Jalal. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you the foreign policy community of Indonesia to be able to participate. It's a pleasure to be here. Just like what Professor Pent was saying, in the case of Brazil, the idea of strategic autonomy is very old. If you look at every single administration in Brazil since the early 60s, all the way to 2024, will always mention one way or another strategic autonomy. That's a long-term goal of Brazil's foreign policy. Brazil has a peculiar place in the world. We are in the Western Hemisphere. So when we talk about strategic autonomy, the first thing that we think about, like many other countries in the world, is how far and how close we are to the United States. So if you look at every single administration since the early 60s to 2024, every administration designed a specific foreign policy either to be closer to the US and lose the strategic autonomy, or to move away from the United States and gain some strategic autonomy. So that was if you look at the history of Brazilian foreign policy, that's the entire discussion. If you look, for example, Lula's administration today, Lula's overall reaching idea is to build a multipolar order. And they believe that to build that multipolar order, they have to move away from the United States' influence in South America. And the best way to build this strategy is not only to join BRICS, but to have a closer relationship with China, right? Xi Jinping is going to visit Brazil for the G20 summit one day after the summit. And it's possible that Brazil will join the Belt and Road Initiative. Brazil is one of the few Latin American countries that is not there yet. We don't know if it's going to happen or not, but they're negotiating with the Chinese. So the idea here is that China gives us some leverage towards the United States. So in the beginning of your presentation, is the space in international order shrinking for a strategic autonomy or not? I think it's actually the configuration of the world today. It allows countries like Brazil or India to do just like what Professor Pence said about this increased partnerships. And then you can see in the history of Brazil, in the case of Brazil, during, for example, for those who are not familiar with the Brazilian politics, in the 1990s, we had a very important president, President Cardoso, and this slogan of his foreign policy was called autonomy through partnerships. That was the name of this logo of his entire foreign policy. And when it changed to the first administration of Lula in the 2000s, it was autonomy through engagement. So the idea here is that you would gain more autonomy by engaging more and creating new coalitions and participating in the multilateral level as much as you could. So when the BRICS was created in 2008, 2009, that was in our case, it was an evolution of the IPSA, India, Brazil, South Africa coalition. So for us, it was only normal to be part of that. And during Bolsonaro administration, which is the previous administration from Lula, BRICS, some people in Brazil thought because he was a right-wing pro-West president that Brazil will move away from BRICS, would even exit BRICS, and that did not happen. So even from a right-wing president, the idea that BRICS had some importance, strategic importance from Brazil was there. And he decided to request formally Brazil to join OECD. So we almost joined OECD at the last minute. There was a change of presidency to President Lula, and Lula decided to freeze the Brazil membership of the OECD. But we're almost there. If there is a change of circumstances, it's very possible for Brazil to join OECD. Brazil is also invited to most of the G7 summits, and Lula was invited to the last one, and there is some discussion in Brazil, and some people in Brazil even say that if the G7 decides to expand, they could invite countries like Brazil or India. It's possible that Brazil would say yes and continue to be part of BRICS. So just like what Professor Harsh said, in this multipolar world that has some possibility of becoming a bipolar world, the more you hedge, the more you engage with other, and you diversify your political partnerships, the more strategic autonomy you have. The problem there is that there are two great economic powers in the case of Brazil, which is the United States and China, that do have domestic influence in Brazil. So one maybe negative effect of a strategic autonomy or negative side is there are some specific countries that can move the needle in Brazilian domestic politics and create problems for the president in terms of its international strategic autonomy. So you can see that in the case of Bolsonaro, when Bolsonaro was too much against China, and the Chinese embassy in Brazil articulated with the Brazilian farmers to oust the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, who were very vocal against China, and that happened. If today a Minister of Foreign Affairs in Brazil decides to be very vocal against the United States or too aggressive against the United States, it's very possible that the U.S. embassy in Brazil would articulate with part of the opposition to pressure at least this minister in the Senate of Brazil. So Brazil being a democratic system, there is a fragmentation of power inside Brazil. So foreign powers can use this fragmentation of power in their favor against the current president to diminish Brazil's capacity to implement more strategic foreign policy. So the idea here is that, just to summarize, Brazil has a long-term goal of a strategic autonomy. I think we are the way we implement foreign policy in every single administration. We cannot say that we are very close to any of these powers in the world. We are trying to get closer to China, but we're very much close to the United States. So there is a balance there. If you look at the trade composition of Brazil, if you look at the investment composition of Brazil, there is a balance there. I mean, we have a huge surplus with China. We have a deficit with the United States, but we receive way more investments from the United States than we receive from China. But there is always, and when you talk to the Brazilian diplomats and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, that's something in their minds. So, okay, we're gonna get closer to the great powers, whether it's China, Europe, or the United States, but we cannot get so close because we have to save some space of maneuver. And in this sense, the Mercosur European Union agreement that we've been negotiating with the Europeans for 20 years, there is a chance that we finally finalize this agreement on this G20 summit in November. It's a way of building strategic autonomy. So we are getting closer to the Chinese, but we already have a very strong relationship with the United States. But if we sign this agreement with the Europeans, we will have a stronger. We already have a very good relationship with the Europeans in general, but we have an even stronger a relationship with them. It will give us more autonomy, and it will give to the Europeans more autonomy as well. So the idea here is the more you engage, the more you join new coalitions, you build new coalitions, the more autonomous you are. So that was a good start. Okay. Thank you again.
Thank you. Let me just ask you a follow-up question. You know, when we talk about autonomy, strategic autonomy, that, as Harshpan said, it's about freedom to choose, right? And of course,
capacity to say no.
True.
Yeah, the capacity to say
but
no.
Actually, that's my next question. But beyond the freedom to choose is also the ability to say no. And, you know, I was a government official for many years, and in the diplomatic world, sometimes saying no is quite difficult to certain countries, yeah, given their size, their pressure, and their behavior, and so on. And so in the case of Brazil, have that happened where your ability to say no has been compromised by whatever circumstances you're facing?
Yeah, in the past it happened. As in the 1980s when we had a U.S. sanction against us because our economy was too closed, right? So they want to open up Brazil's economy, and that was a lesson learned. It became very clear that we had to, you know, increase the number of partners and have a more global trade composition to not allow the United States to pressure Brazil whenever they want to. So the idea was that in order to be able to say no, you have to have strategic options. So that's the idea today of trying to improve Brazil's relationship with China. The problem is that how far you can go with the Chinese. You have to remember, my area of expertise in Brazilian foreign policy is surveys, and we ask Brazilian people what they think of foreign policy and international relations. And China and Brazil is viewed positively. So we don't see the Chinese rise as a threat to the global order or to international liberal order. That's something that is seen in the West, but not in Brazil. We have a way more positive view of the United States in Brazil than of China. China is seen in Brazil as a business opportunity more than as a partner. But the government is using this as a way of building Brazil's capacity to say no to the United States. Once you do, but then you have the problem of not being able to say no to China, right? Because China might pressure you in specific areas they want. So that's why you have to have more engagement. So in a way that you can use the United States as leverage against China. So that's a very difficult foreign policy and diplomacy to implement. It needs a very sophisticated capacity to play use different hats depending on the circumstances. Having a stronger relationship with Europe is important, but also building a regional integration scheme in South America, and that's been our Achilles heel. Brazil's incapacity although Brazil's let's say power within South America is much greater than any other South American country. The other day I was running the correlates of war database, and Brazil's power vis-a-vis other South American countries is like 5 times higher. It's one of the few regions in the world in which one power is much greater than the others, right? Although there is this huge difference, it's very difficult for Brazil to be a regional leader. It's very complicated. In other countries, other great powers like China and the United States, as they want to have more influence in South America, they play these other small states in our neighborhood against Brazil sometimes. The United States is doing that with Argentina nowadays against President Lula, because President Milei in Argentina is very close to the West or to the United States. So that's another problem when you want to have strategic autonomy, is that you need South America to back you up. So in order for you to have a more global prominence, but sometimes South America not only does not back you up, it becomes a problem, like Venezuela today. You know, we didn't have any capacity of changing the scenario in Venezuela. We wanted to change, but our capacity was null or zero. US and China were much more influential in Venezuela than Brazil was. And that it shouldn't be that way.
Thank you. And I think that reinforces what I've always believed, that if you want to have a strategic autonomy that works, you must have craft, you must have leadership, you must have political courage. Otherwise, it's just a waste. We talk about saying no, and I was just in Germany. I flew Lufthansa. They are very good at saying no. And in Germany, people don't miss words. If they don't like something, if they don't like you or whatever, or what you're doing, they say no immediately, no matter where you come from. So, Stefan, how does strategic autonomy apply to Germany? You can agree or disagree on the saying no part, but I'm sure I'm not too far off.
I would blame Dino. It's rather different in foreign policy. And let me say good morning to the Eastern Hemisphere and good evening to the Western Hemisphere. And I'm right in the middle of it. Now, let me get back to the definition of strategic autonomy. And I think for me, it's quite simple. It's the ability to set one's own priorities and to make one's own decisions and to implement them. And I think this requires, as you already said, some degree of political will, some degree of political courage, but also functioning institutions and material capabilities. And you can find this definition in a major study we published here at SWP, is still available on our website some 5 years ago. And this was at a time we really had a high point, so to speak, in Europe of discussing strategic autonomy. Very much under the impression of 3 to 4 years of Trump administration, which identified Europe more as a bunch of foes than of indispensable allies, and nourished some doubts about the transatlantic relations. But since then, the discussion in Europe on strategic autonomy has quite subdued. And this is a consequence, of course, of the Biden administration, where we have a convinced transatlanticist in the White House, but also, I think, more important, so a consequence of the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion in Ukraine, which I think taught the Europeans that their strategic autonomy, at least in terms of security, is quite limited, because we all know that without having, and I refer now to this partner relationship to the United States, without a senior partner, United States, we would have been simply overwhelmed in Europe by the Russian invasion. So since then, I think I'm not aware that we really have an intensive discussion in Europe on strategic autonomy, replaced a little bit by the term strategic solidarity, and to avoid any kind of impression that we would like to decouple from our senior partner, the United States. I think this might quite dramatically change again after November 5th. Depends who wins the elections in the United States. And if we are confronted in Europe again with a Trump administration, then I expect that we will get back to our discussion on strategic autonomy, where we stand and what we have to do to improve on this. And here the picture is quite mixed. I think we have some challenges with regards to institutional capacities. You certainly know that foreign policy decisions. Oh no, I have to say, when we in Germany talk about strategic autonomy, we rarely refer to the national level. We always discuss it in the context of the European Union. So we always talk about the strategic autonomy of the European Union. And we see in the European Union in the mid and long term as the decisive actor in this. And when you look at the European Union, I think, as I said, you have some challenges. We still have to make all our foreign policy decisions in consensus, which makes it quite difficult to do them. And Feliciano already referred to the Mercosur agreement, where we also have some degree of disagreement in the European Union. I think we also have some shortcomings with regard to material capabilities, especially in the field of defense and security. We are improving a bit, but I think we are still far away from really having strategic autonomy in this policy area in Europe.
Okay. Well, Turkey is a member of NATO, a treaty ally, but there are issues whereby they seem to be exercising strategic autonomy. Yeah, I think on policies in the Middle East, for example, and a number of other issues. They say, yes, we're a member of NATO, but on these issues, we take a different line, right? I think the same thing with, I think, Norway, Spain, and Ireland, yeah, on the question of the present Israel-Gaza crisis. I'm just wondering, for Germany, are there issues where you would say, hey, if the United States is not going to take the lead on that issue, whatever that issue may be, then we're going to take a different route without harming our transatlantic alliance, or without harming our European commitments? Have there been occasions like that? I think on the Iraq war, you chose to be quite critical towards the United States, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, we of course we disagreed with the United States in some instances in the past, but I think on the more fundamental issues, at least under the present administration, we agree on most of the issues. And as I said, the big challenge for Germany is how really to ensure its own security and to build up defense capabilities. And I must emphasize again, this in a European context. I think it's quite difficult to imagine for Germany that we leave or put into question the alliances we operate in because of our history. I think this is one of the main reasons for that. So both the Transatlantic Alliance and the European Union are the two essential points of reference for German foreign policy. As I said, it might change under Trump 2 administration. We know that at least some senior figures of such a future administration and Trump himself has puts the Article 5 of the NATO Treaty into question, and by that really undermining Europe's security. And then the big question is for Europe how to organize and to prepare for its own defense and for its own security. But as I said, this very much depends on the outcome of the elections in the United States.
Yeah. Stefan, I can understand your position towards Russia. Yeah, it has to be very much aligned with the position of Europe and especially the United States. But what about China? Is that possible for Germany to take a more autonomous position with regard to China relative to the United States, for example? Or have you decided that we always have to be in the same corridor as our Western allies on this?
No, this is not the case. I think we certainly on China, we have taken a bit more autonomous position. We always refused that Germany and Europe should decouple for China. We used and introduced the term of de-risking. So we see the necessity to reduce risks which exist in our dependencies in certain areas from China. But we don't see really that we should decouple from China. As you said, our economic position with regard to China is very different from the United States position on this. For us, it's still the most important trading partner, the second most important trading partner, heavy investment of German companies in China. And this, of course, also influences our foreign policy. And we always had to try to keep the balance somehow between a more drastic position taken by the United States and the requirement to still have a partnership with China. Now, I would say you're right. Here we have taken certainly a more autonomous position, and yeah.
Okay, now, I'll go back to Harshpant. Professor, so we heard Stefan, and I think from the German or European experience, strategic autonomy was somewhat losing currency given Russia's invasion of Ukraine and so on. I think collective strength is valued more in the European experience. But for some reason, for India, it's a different story. It seems that, and maybe this is true for Brazil also, so Feliciano can comment later on this, but is strategic autonomy gaining more currency now among India's foreign policy establishment?
Dino, I think it is, and I think the reason is in some ways India feels more confident about projecting its own idea of the world on the global stage today than say in the past. It is sort of more of a it has more capabilities. It has I think. It has partners which are willing to work with it despite some ups and downs. So I think that space that perhaps in the past was seen from a position of weakness, today it has expanded because of some of India's inherent strengths that are coming to the fore at this point in time. So I think this is perhaps a moment that Indian policymakers want to capture and want to initiate a discussion on. And I think this idea of strategic autonomy allows India to do that. It allows India inherent flexibility in its approach to multiple partnerships, as we were discussing. It allows India to join different blocks and be part of them for different reasons. It allows India to articulate its voice on different issues in different ways. So I think there is an inherent strength that India feels it has that is being projected through some of its foreign policy outreach. I think the problem that India is facing and might face also in the future is, of course, strategic partnership will work. It is also contingent on how, and perhaps for that matter, all foreign policy is contingent on what others also do to you. So it's half of foreign policies, only half of what you do to others, and most of it is what others do to you. Now, in this context, our relationship with China and the downfall that it has seen in the last few years, particularly since 2020, also then it also then constrains India's options. in a sense that if, for example, our partnership with China, like Felicio was saying in the context of Brazil, it's an expanding partnership. Most Brazilians look at China as a favorable actor. It's exactly the opposite. In India, most Indians look at China as a problematic actor. It is seen as a country that is that creates problems for India. It is seen as a country that does not want to see India as a major player on the global stage. And of course, with the border dispute which escalated in 2020, things have completely gone awry. So in that sense, if you have one element of the emerging global order, one pole of the emerging global order standing in stark contestation to you, then I think the space also gets eroded in some ways, because then the question is that our partnership with the West will have to continue, because our partnership with the West will become a bulwark against Chinese attempt at expansionism vis-a-vis India. So therefore, I think the issue would be that for India now would be how India recalibrates, if at all, its relationship with China, because at the moment it's in doldrums. Now, if it is able to do that, then I think the space increases further, like Felicio was explaining in the context of Brazil. But if it continues to go down, if the perception continues to be negative, then I think despite India having a lot of economic relationship with China, the strategic template will become constrained. And I think therefore, strategic autonomy in a real sense, when you said, you need diplomacy, you need policymakers, you need leadership. It can only operate as well as the world that you are offered. So in a sense, if the world that you are offered is coming down on you and is relatively antagonistic, then I think the challenge on one side will exacerbate. Now, you can compare, for example, that when I was talking about the Ukraine situation, Ukraine could work. Post-Ukraine, India's ties with Russia and India's ties with the West continue to develop along the same lines, and India could, find some room to maneuver. Partly because, Russia and West both look at India as a partner. But this does not apply in the context of China. And I think that is going to be a real big challenge for India as to how it maneuvers that space and how that strategic autonomy actually operates on the ground when it comes to this big question of our times, which is the US-China contestation.
Thank you. Feliciano, same question. Is strategic autonomy seen as a bigger deal now in Brazil's foreign policy than ever before? Yeah.
Oh, yes, for sure. And during Lula's administration, you have to remember that in case of Brazil, strategic autonomy is intertwined with national development. Brazil does not wage wars. The last time we went to a war in the neighborhood was 1865. The last time we participated in an actual war was World War II. So we don't have strategic problems. We are isolated in this part of the world. We are in the Western Hemisphere, but we are far away from the United States, even in the Western Hemisphere. We have no regional threats. We are protected by the Atlantic Ocean on one side. We're protected by the Andes Mountains on the other side. So Brazil has we have more, geographically speaking, we have more room of maneuver. So that's when you compare to India, for example. We don't have a border with India. So that's one of the main reasons why we are rebuilding our relationship with China, right? And we don't want, like India and China have a border. That's the problem. In Brazil, we don't have border problems with any other country. So China became to us over the years a country from which you can actually protect yourself from the United States, because historically speaking, the United States was, especially within the left in Brazil, perceived as more as a threat than as an economic opportunity. Although the Brazilian people really like the United States, see the United States very positively, the policymakers in Brazil tend to see the United States, if we get too close to the United States, whether it's politically or economically, we lose automatically strategic autonomy. Over the 15, 16 governments that we had since the end of World War II, only 2 governments clearly stated that they wanted to have a very close relationship with the United States. And in both times, the relationship didn't work well because the United States did not reply. The United States itself does not see Brazil as a country where they can really invest in terms of political investment or economic investment, because it's not a threat to the United States. It's not a problem maker. It's isolated here. It does not create any problems. It doesn't wage wars. So, but in our case, the idea that if we get too close to the US, we will lose this autonomy. So that's why China, for us, as Soviet Union in the past, was a country in which you can use as leverage against the United States. But because after 4 years of Bolsonaro, that two ideological reasons, China they were trying to turn China into Brazil's enemy. They're like far right government tends to think that way, just like Trump or many others in Europe. Lula decided that they had to rebuild this relationship. That's why you see so many visits, official visits from Brazilian authorities to China, so many Chinese visits to Brazil in the last 1 year and a half. However, the problem here is that, as I said before, how far you can go there, and in the end of the day, if the US is just like Professor Pence said, strategic autonomy depends on what the other is going to do to you. What if the United States decides to retaliate? I wrote a piece with my colleague on Foreign Affairs in which we argue for a hedging strategy to Brazil vis-a-vis the US, China, in Europe, and all the other partners. And the main argument is that we have to diversify our partnerships. We have to have trade relationship with everybody. We can never depend on one single country. If we depend on China for trade, we depend on the United States for investment and vice versa. But the problem is that the more you do the hedging, the other side will never fully trust on you because they know you're hedging, and they might decide to retaliate instead of giving you more carrots, because that's the problem today. So what if we join the Belt and Road Initiative, and we start to sign more and more agreements with the Chinese, and then the US decides the cheaper route. It's much more expensive to the United States to give us carrots, which is give us a trade deal or more investment that they are already doing. It's cheaper for them to retaliate, to use the amount of instruments they have, diplomatic instruments they have, to like corner Brazil in one specific issue. And I give you a minor example. Brazil has a private company that produces artillery, rockets and missiles. And that company was going bankrupt, and they are not finding anyone to buy or to invest on them domestically. But Norinco from China decided to show up and say, we'll buy 50% of the stocks. We'll still allow Brazil to control the company, but we'll give you 50% of the stocks. Automatically, the US embassy in Brazil retaliated, said, if you allow the Chinese companies to buy Brazil's #1 private company in security and defense, Embraer, which is Brazil's airplane manufacturer, we will not be able to sell specific airplanes in the American market or the European market. So Brazil had no other choice but to step back and cancel the agreement with the Chinese. And now the Brazilian government is looking for another private company in Brazil to buy 50% of the stocks of the Avibras, which is this company. That's one, and I can give you many other examples. It's much cheaper for a great power to do that. So again, you need a very sophisticated diplomacy, and it's very difficult to find out where is the red line. Now, what is the type of issues that you cannot cross? And I try to convey to my friends in Brasilia that when it comes to China, we cannot talk about defense and security, because the West will immediately retaliate. That's the cheapest way for them to do it. That's why we're now seeking this great partnership with India on the area of air defense that we are lacking in Brazil. It's very likely that we're going to sign a huge defense agreement with the Indians on that area. That's one benefits of being a member of the BRICS, because if you look at the history of Brazil and India relationship, it was not so close before BRICS. After BRICS, we're very much closer now, and that allows this type of this agreement in area of defense and security. In India, if we sign this agreement with the Indians, it's unlikely that the West or Europe will retaliate or punish Brazil. But if we do it, the Russians or the Chinese, they will do it. So this is a thin balance that you have to have in order to preserve the strategic autonomy you have.
Thank you. Stefan, you've heard the constraints mentioned by Harshpan and then Feliciano on strategic autonomy. Would you agree that no country in the world is actually 100% autonomous when making their foreign policy? Yeah.
Yeah, I think autonomy is a relative concept, and of course, to have 100% autonomy, I don't know whether the United States can claim at least being close to it, but we in Europe are still far away from it, and I think that the most important reason for that is security, and both Feliciano and Harsh already referred to this area. When you have a real major security challenge in your immediate neighborhood, and you have to deal with this, and the challenge has somehow superior power, then your autonomy is quite limited. Either you have to submit to the superior power, or you need allies like the United States to deal with this. And I think Europe is in a quite different position than both Brazil and India, or Germany more specifically. Brazil, as Feliciano already pointed out, is in a quite comfortable security position, not really being threatened by any major power in the immediate neighborhood. And India, I think, changed its security position quite tremendously by acquiring nuclear weapons. And so I think, of course, they have security challenges, but in a quite strong position. And in Europe, I think it's rather different. We have two nuclear powers here, France and United Kingdom, but the rest of Europe depends on the extended nuclear deterrence provided by the United States. And I think this this provides certain restrictions and limits to the autonomy you can have in this field.
Yeah, Stefan, I understand the point you made earlier that given the war in Europe, the relationship, the North Atlantic Pact relationship have to be kept strong. But I also want to ask, are you also seeing increased relations by Germany with middle powers of the global South? Do you see anything significant in that space? I say this because in Indonesia, we're seeing quite significant boosts in Indonesia-Korea relationship. We're building submarines together, for example. Indonesia-Australia relationship, which is a country of the global North, for example. Well, it's South, down under, but it's a Western country, and we just signed a quite historic security agreement between the two countries, right? Indonesia, well, I can go on and on, but the point is that middle powers of the South seem to be, there's a pattern of developing closer relations with middle powers of the North. Yeah. Is that something that you see?
Yes, clearly. And when you look, I think, at the diplomatic activities, both of state as well as government officials in Germany, there is a certain degree, I would even say, of hyperactivity to reach out to middle powers of the global South. I don't know how often government officials have been now to India, to Brazil, but also to Southeast Asia and African countries compared to the state or visits of in the past. So I think we realized here in Germany that middle powers like Indonesia, India, and Brazil play a very important role in shaping the future world order. And so there are quite significant efforts to reach out to them, to define new partnerships. We even now discuss with India something which we have refused to discuss for decades, whether we should supply arms to India on a by far higher level than we did before. The same is the case to many other countries. Now we realized both there is a new role for the middle powers and that we have to do more to define the partnerships to them. And I think the main reason, again, and sorry to come back again to this, was the Russian invasion in Ukraine, because right after the invasion had taken place, you remember we had this resolution in the General Assembly of the United Nations, where many of the countries we regarded as like-minded or close to us decided either to abstain or to vote against the resolution. And then we realized that we can't take these countries as partners being granted to us, and I think this was certainly the beginning of a significant change in German diplomacy and foreign policy.
Thank you. I'll go back to Harsh. Professor Harsh, the title of our webinar is North-South Middle Powers. I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Is India a middle power? And please, you're smiling, but you're going to answer the same question too.
No, I do think that India is a middle power that is trying to, in some ways, both galvanize other middle powers to do certain to create its own space and its own voice, but also at the same time work with other major powers to see that its interests remain embedded in the wider international order, where it can sort of, again, not simply keep on being a recipient, but also contribute to global governance. One of the interesting things, and we were discussing with Stefan, Germany's approach, and I think India as a middle power has also had some very interesting dynamic. For example, in the Indo-Pacific, we look at one of the things that Indo-Pacific is now known for is that you have a plethora of minilaterals. So many of these plurilaterals have emerged, trilaterals, the quadrilateral dialogue that has. I think if you think about it from a middle power perspective, here you have a geography like the Indo-Pacific where there are no institutions, where the great power contestation is actually is sharpening by the day. So the middle power contribution has actually been to bring some institutional framework to the Indo-Pacific. And I think plurilaterals, minilaterals have been a very interesting way of doing that. So if you think of all the trilaterals, and if you think of even the Quad, the second iteration of the Quad came not because Americans were pushing for Quad, but because the Japanese, the Australians, and the Indians were pushing for the Quad. That something needs to come out of this engagement. And I think in some ways this relationship that middle powers are forging with other middle powers is perhaps a big, in some ways, an element of stability in an otherwise very fragile international system. And therefore, when we say that, look, the major powers or the big powers are actually very inward oriented or are actually causing a lot of problems, you do see the role of middle powers becoming more and more salient. And India has taken that that also somewhat seriously in terms of both pushing forth an idea of some kind of governance frameworks in the global order, but also contributing by building bridges with other middle powers, whether in the global north or global south. And I think that is why some of this discussion becomes very interesting, that you now have a situation where some of the things where the aspiration of a closer partnership was in the past in Indian foreign policy establishment was seen as a constraint on your ability to do things that you wanted to do, or as a constraint on your ability to project your profile, is now seen as an important element of contributing to global governance in the maritime space, in the digital space, in the climate space. I think all the global governance issues, if you do see very interesting building of bridges, and all the things that we were talking about, Brazilians and Indians talking about a defense relationship, Germans and Indians talking about a defense relationship, Indonesia doing its own thing, as you were pointing out, with several countries in the region. I think these all point to this vacuum in the international system where major powers have really failed or seemingly failed, and middle powers have an opportunity to do something with it. And I think that's what these relationships, these various configurations, bilaterals, trilaterals, quadrilaterals, and others are trying to contribute. Whether they succeed or not, that remains to be seen. But I do think that at a time of institutional void in the multilateral system, you do see some innovations happening from middle powers, which in and of themselves are quite interesting. And I think that is where India has also pitched its tent and somewhat making an argument about its own role in global governance. For a long time, India was criticized as being a country that is very good at pointing problems, but not good at providing solutions. I think now India is trying to change that image and saying that, look, if we have certain kinds of partnerships, perhaps it allows us for that possibility. But again, without the role that China or the US or the Europe, what kind of a role they will play in this contestation will also determine some of this some of the output from these initiatives. But I think just having those initiatives on the board, just proposing those initiatives, I think still we are seeing a long. I think India and other countries have seemingly crossed a certain kind of a Rubicon in ways of contributing to the wider global governance.
Thank you. Thank you. Feliciano, Brazil, middle power?
Well, it is, but I'm sure a lot of Brazilians don't like to be. It's a long discussion here in Brazil. Is that one thing is how we define middle powermanship or emerging powers as a academic concept. Another thing is how policymakers use the concept, right? So, for example, if you look at Cardoso administration that I mentioned before, from 1994 to 2002, they use middle power as a normal concept. The idea there is that, so Brazil is a middle power. Brazil is not a great power. Brazil is not a small power. We are somewhere between. So if you are somewhere between, you have more power in specific areas than others. So you have to produce what we call, the literature calls it the niche diplomacy, right? In the case of Brazil, South American integration, climate change, or food security. These are areas in which our relative power is greater. So we should have a more active foreign policy there. So that was Cardoso administration's official conceptualization of Brazil's place in the world. But when Lula came along in 2003, they used to criticize this conceptualization, saying that Brazil was punching below its weight. For a country of this size, 8th largest economy in the world, 5th largest country geographically, 7th population, being a middle power was not enough for Brazil. So Brazil, of course, was not a great power. So what is the concept between the two? Emerging power. The idea that in order to evolve from a middle power to a great power, you have to go through this phase of emergent power. So now you have to change your diplomacy and your foreign policy. Now it's not enough to have more power in specific areas. You have to participate and engage in other areas that you're not so used to participate. Specifically in the case of Brazil, in defense and security, in wars. So the example of first Lula's administration was the 2010 Tehran agreement between Turkey, Brazil, and Iran that failed. And back then, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Celso Amorim, who is today Lula's current foreign affairs advisor, wrote an entire book justifying why did Brazil fail in 2010 agreement. But the idea that we have to do more and participate more and engage in areas of security and defense was there. And now with Lula's third administration is back. That's why Brazil is talking about the war in Ukraine all the time. We just published this agreement, this peace proposal with the Chinese on the war in Ukraine. That's why Brazil is engaging so much in the Gaza war, criticizing Israel so harshly. And what is the problem of being an emerging power in the case of Brazil? So the problem of being a middle power is punching below its weight. The problem about with being an emerging power, it's overstretching or going beyond your means and participate in areas and issues that you actually don't have any power or material power to participate. So now that's how the opposition criticized Lula. Is that Lula is spending too much time in Ukraine and Gaza and not enough time here in South America. That's why the crisis of Venezuela was so great that he couldn't do anything. So that's a dilemma that actually we can never solve in Brazil, because we might be a middle power, but every time you enact or formulate a foreign policy in world, automatically the opposition will criticize it and weaken you because saying that you are too small. Being a middle power is too small for Brazil. Right? But when you do the opposite of that, which is to become an emerging power, then it's too great to Brazil. So where is actually where is the thing? What is the balance here? It's actually impossible to tell. And just on your previous questions to Harsh on how middle powers relate to each other, I think that's again and to Stefan too, it's key to Brazil. If you look at, for example, we are building submarines. Indonesia is building submarines with the South Koreans. We are building submarines with the French. We are building frigates for the Navy with the Germans, and if you look at the composition of weapon systems in Brazil, they are predominantly either American or Europeans, but more and more Europeans. Right? And that's an area of defense and security. And I can give you, we are signing now an agreement, a bilateral agreement with the United States on the area of strategic minerals to supply the United States with the new Inflation Reduction Act policy that they want to have a steady supplies of strategic minerals from partners that are close to them rather than China. Brazil has a lot of rare earth deposits in Brazil that could be explored further. So you see, that's with the United States. But if you look at the defense agreement with the Indians, and Indonesia is a country that Brazil still has to build a relationship with. I think if Indonesia was a part of BRICS, that would be easier for Brazil to reach out to Indonesia. But that's very important. If you build relationship with other middle powers, it creates you the protection that you must have in your relationship with great powers.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, just for your update, the Indonesian foreign minister will go to the BRICS summit in Kazan, I think next week. And I think the new president, Prabowo Subianto of Indonesia, I think will be meeting President Lula either in Peru or in Brazil. He's scheduled to attend both APEC and G20 summit. So that will be interesting. But whether or not Indonesia will join BRICS or just join BRICS plus arrangement, that remains to be seen. But certainly Indonesia will continue to press on with our OECD membership. Yeah. So I'm going to take some questions now. There's a question from Feroz from Indonesia, and I will address this to Stefan. The question is, for issues such as critical minerals, technology, or supply chain, to what extent is strategic autonomy an important issue?
Yeah, it's a very important issue in this regard. And we had met in the past years some efforts in the European Union and Germany to deal with this. We realized how dependent we were from Russian energy supply in the past. So we changed this quite significantly in the past years. We have now a Critical Raw Materials Act in the European Union, which provides somehow the framework for the European Union to be more active in diversification of critical raw materials and also the processing of critical raw materials. We have a new directive on anti-coercion measures. So in the field of economics, I think we have really made some progress, at least in creating the instruments we need to decrease dependencies and deal with these issues. But again, it's a very important, it's an essential area.
Okay. The next question is from Adinda. I think this is addressed to Harsh. Professor Harsh, do you think strategic autonomy and non-alignment are entirely the same concepts, or is there different nuances attached to the two concepts? Strategic
I think
and non-alignment, yes.
I think strategic autonomy is part of is one part of the idea of non-alignment. It is the non-alignment is a bigger concept, bigger idea. But strategic autonomy, I think, is at the heart of that idea. There are several other elements associated with it. You can be strategically autonomous also by, as I said, in the past, the non-alignment idea, when it emerged, it was this idea that the countries of that time during the Cold War did not want to be part of any power bloc, either of the two power blocs, the Eastern or the Western. And I think the sense it was driven by this idea that we want to have freedom of choice. We want to retain our choices in terms of where we want to go. That drove that idea. Now, I think what has happened is that today, if you think of a strategic autonomy, you think of strategic autonomy being pursued through partnerships, as we were discussing over the last hour. And I think that's the change in terms of the idea of non-alignment, which was that we don't want to be closely aligned with any partner. We don't want to be in some ways we want to be distinct from these Cold War power blocs. these, whether it was NATO or whether it was what was happening with the Warsaw Pact. And I think now, if you think the sense that because we live in a world of fluid partnerships, in any case, having close partnerships with multiple partners allows us greater autonomy to make our choices. So I think while strategic autonomy and non-alignment are two in some ways distinct ideas, the core of strategic autonomy and the core idea has always been part of the non-alignment or non-aligned movement in some ways, which was in the way, at least, that the idea was driven initially. Now, later on, it morphed into something and different aspects, but I think the core was very, very much the idea of strategic autonomy.
Harsh, let me ask you this. The kind of relationship India has with the United States now, the strategic partnership, that would be unthinkable 50 years ago, right? Is that correct?
Yes. I think the 30 years ago, it would have been very difficult to envision. I think today, because of various reasons, but I do think that in some ways, India's own attempt, India's own building of capacities and greater confidence that you can maneuver this relationship in ways that are not largely subsuming your identity has made it possible for it to happen.
Okay. The next question is from Kim. The question, I guess, would be to Feliciano. In a time of very intense economic dependency, what is the best way for countries to maintain their strategic autonomy nonetheless? I guess a lot of countries are in that position. Yes.
That's a difficult. Thank you for the question. It's a difficult question. I think going back to what I previously said, I think in the case of Brazil's foreign policy history, the key goal of Brazil's foreign policy was national development, right? So we would use the foreign policy as an instrument to acquire abroad the investments, the technology, and the market access that we needed for our economic development. And that didn't change much. As I said before, we don't wage wars, so security and defense, so there is always there, but it's not the #1 priority of Brazil's foreign policy. When it comes to national development, the overreaching idea for the longest time is that you needed to diversify your trade partners, your investment partners, the most you could, right? So that was, and if you look at the composition of Brazil trade balance over the last, I would say 50 years, is very much balanced, right? We don't rely so much on the United States, so it's an important partner, or Europe, or China now, or Russia and the Soviet Union in the past, and so on and so forth. So the idea here is that interdependence was different from dependence. So if you have a very strong relationship with the United States, for example, in the economic area, you'll be very much dependent on the United States. And there were a lot of criticism in Brazil against that, because they used to use examples of South Korea, for example. South Korea built this impressive relationship with the United States after the Korean War. And now look at how much more South Korea is developed compared to Brazil today. So being close to the United States, and look at the Western Europe after World War II. Being close to the United States was an opportunity for them to grow exponentially. And Brazil had this no-alignment strategy from 1950s and tried to move away from the United States and missed some opportunity there. That's a somewhat valid argument, but you had to realize that the United States never looked at Brazil in the same level that they looked at South Korea or the Western Europe. We were never in their radar. They never made investments in Brazil as they did in other countries, or gave Brazil the market access that they gave to other countries due to strategic reasons. So in this part of the world, you have no other alternative to diversify. Diversify is the word against economic dependency. Sometimes you will miss opportunity because you will not attach yourself to countries that are rising so rapidly. But at the end of the day, you retain some strategic autonomy despite of that. In Spanish, there is a saying that if you translate to it in English is that in Latin America, you have to make you have two choices to make. You are either the tail of a lion or you are the head of a mouse, right? So you either attach to the United States and become the tail of a lion, you are a lion, but you're the tail, or you decide to be yourself and you're just the head of a mouse, but you are a mouse. So that's a difficult choice. Brazil was always in between these two, was never clear in one side or another. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, the next question is from Jenny. This webinar is about multipolarity. So my question is to Stefan. Stefan, do you consider Germany a pole in Europe?
In Europe, certainly. The question is whether it's a pole on the global scale. And do you hear me? Yes, you hear me. On a global scale. And here again, I think Germany refers usually to the European Union as a global pole. And of course, sees a quite important role within the European Union for German foreign policy. But let me make a brief remark on this concept of a multipolar world, which is quite important to me, and that goes back to the beginning of our discussion. I think what we still have to understand is that even a multipolar world needs basic international rules we all have to adhere to. And this is, I think, the special difficulty we have in Europe with the position taken by some middle powers with regards to the Russian war in the Ukraine. As we think this is such a fundamental breach of international rules, that's not really an issue of avoiding making a choice by not taking the sides of Ukraine or Russia, but that it's necessary to condemn this quite fundamental breach of international rules. And there, from our point of view, also a multipolar world needs a certain set of basic principles we all adhere to. And this is less about making choices between two power blocks. And Harsh knows this discussion because we have had it again and again on this issue. And this is the reason why we have that difficulties to understand the position taken by some of the middle powers of the global south.
I think I agree with your point about multipolarity and the need to respect the norms. But I think the emerging view in the global south now is that these norms are not being applied equally, and there are countries who get a free pass when they're violated. And I think what I see now, while trust is still high, among Indonesia and Germany, Indonesia and US, India and France or UK, whatever, credibility of the West is declining. So the strategic trust is high among these countries, but the credibility of the West in recent times have somewhat declined. Yeah, well.
I fully agree on this, and this is really the major issues we really lost credibility in this regard in the past decades, and this is certainly the case.
Yes. Okay. Another question for I guess this is for Harsh and Feliciano as well, which is how do you relate strategic autonomy with non-interference? As we know, in countries in the global south, this is a very sensitive issue, and in fact, it's a very critical norm, non-interference, right? So that means when we deal with each other, we have no intention to judge you or to undermine your authority at home or to interfere in your domestic affairs, right? But how does this link to strategic autonomy in events or occasions where there's too much interference? Does that undermine strategic autonomy? I think this is something, and this is going to be the last question, but I think this is something that Indonesia also experienced at some points, where we had just too many foreign interference from outside countries, from great powers. There was proxy conflicts in Indonesia and so on. And at just some point, we just lost our ability to be in control of our event shaping our our affairs here. So what is your comment on that, Harsh, and maybe Feliciano, if you want to comment on this too? Interference, non-interference, and strategic autonomy. Are they sisters? Yeah. Are they brothers?
I think it's an it's certainly a very important aspect of the norms that Stefan was talking about, and it was in fact such a fundamental. It continues to be such a fundamental norm that at one point in time, India was part. When India was in the early 1990s talking about its Russia, China, India trilateral. This aspect of non-interference in internal affairs was a major, issue that brought Russia, India, China together. And in fact, in the literature, in the academic literature, they are termed as sovereignty hawks. So there was a sense that this is something under no circumstances should be violated, and this was in the 1990s when you had this. Great end of history hypothesis and how the world was changing, perhaps from a Western perspective. We saw certain kinds of interventions being taken, being made. I think that created a lot of a challenge for a country like India. And at that point in time, India even thought it fit to work with like-minded countries like China and Russia. Now, of course, you have a situation where China is, from India's vantage point, seen as a major violator of this norm. So you do live in a very strange way in a world where norms are evolving very, very rapidly, and non-interference for a lot of the global South countries has been a fundamental principle that has to be embedded in the international system, and which gives certain kinds of equality and respect. Mutual respect, happens between states, and I think that norm was so repeatedly violated that, unfortunately, today, you see it more reflected in that violation, and therefore perhaps this assessment in the global South, this resistance in the global South against a lot of these, whether it is in some cases the West, and now of course also the West is facing a lot of problems also of interference. So it's not simply that you have the countries of the global South which are facing this problem of democracies, open democracies. I think Feliciano was talking about Brazil, how different actors can interfere internally in that space. So with technology, you do have a different layer of complication that is now involved in how democracies can be manipulated by external powers. So I do think that requires a kind of some engagement among like-minded countries. How do we go about it, and how do we think about the implications of the changing, both the normative space as well as the technological space in this regard, and whether the two can actually work together to create some kind of a synergy. But for the global South, because of their colonial legacy, where they are coming from, their historical precedent, I think these issues will remain very, very salient, and therefore a fundamental aspect of the way they look at the world order. So I do think that they are connected. I do think the sensitivities in the global South particularly are connected, but I don't think that this issue is primarily now about global South. This is a global issue now, which implicates everyone. Interference can be seen in different ways, but I think that will have to be an engagement from all sides.
Yeah, thank you. Feliciano, I think you have the last word on this. We are almost out of time. Yeah, please.
I'll be quick. I think I agree with most of what Professor Penn said. In the case of Brazil, no intervention is so important that it became one of the 5 principles of Brazil's foreign policy enacted in the constitution of the country. So the foreign policy must always follow the principle of no intervention. So no intervention was created as a protective principle in the case of Brazil, because we suffered a political intervention in 1964 by the United States that promoted the military coup in Brazil and supported a dictatorship that lasted for 21 years. So this is very traumatic in our case. But that's one side of the no intervention principle. The other side that I think is growing in Brazil now is the other side of no intervention is that what do you do with other countries? Do you intervene in other countries, especially in South America? Because there is a clash between strategic idea of no intervention and democratic values. Because what happened in Venezuela now was not a fair election. And a lot of people in Brazil, and the opposition mainly, but also the Brazilian people, we run these surveys, and Brazilians have a very negative view of Venezuela, and they think that Venezuela should change its political regime. So is the country that always defended no-interventionism now is going to defend interventionism in the case of Venezuela, because we need to promote democracy in Venezuela, since it's a neighboring country that is going through a change that is turning into a dictatorship and is affecting Brazil's borders. We received more than 1 million Venezuelan immigrants in the last 2 years. So there is a growing clash between democratic values and no-interventionism as a principle in Brazil when it relates to our neighboring countries. So this is something more or less new. I don't know if it's new, but it's new to Brazil when it comes to the idea of no-interventionism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we have come to the end of our discussion, and this has been very, very fascinating. We talk about strategic autonomy, we talk about middle powers, multipolarity, partnerships, the world order, and non-interference. So I really value the different perspectives that all the participants from the middle power countries bring. And by the way, if I'm looking at Indonesia as a middle power country, but I'm looking at football superpower in Brazil and Germany, and we're doing quite well, by the way. Stefan and Feliciano, Indonesia is doing very well in the Asian.
We'll see.
So I look forward to.
We used to be a superpower. We are a declining power in the area of soccer and football.
Well, we'll see. Messi is it can be forever, right?
Messi is in Argentina. I wish Messi was born in Brazil. I regret immensely that he was born in Argentina.
Feliciano, I'm sure you will be back quite soon.
I'm very proud. Yes, and I'm very proud we can't beat Brazil or Germany. We always beat India in football. So even though India beat Indonesia on cricket, but we don't care.
India plays football with the bats.
Well, thank you. This has been very fascinating. I learned quite a lot about strategic autonomy.
Thank you for having us.
Continue these conversations. Yeah. Thank you very much for everybody for watching, and I'll return the mic to Adinda.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Dino, for moderating today's discussion. And thank you all to the speakers for sharing your incredible insights. It has been a very fruitful discussion, and I'm sure the audience has found the session useful. Today's discussion is available for rewatch on FPCI's official YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. To keep updated on FPCI events and activities, you may follow our social media handles on Instagram or X at FPCI Indo. And we're also glad to announce that FPCI will celebrate its 10th anniversary by hosting our flagship conference on Indonesian policy, the largest grassroots conference in the country. This year's event theme is Can Middle Powers Calm the Storm and Fix the World? It will take place on November 30th in Jakarta, Indonesia. Once again, thank you so much to everybody for tuning in, and see you all at our next event. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.